Okay, so in our last episode we set up the pinion depth. Now I'm ready to assemble the gear sets completely. I've got my input shaft and my pinion shaft, and this is a quick way you can make sure you got all the gears on in the right way. So if you messed up your gearing and maybe switch this gear with this gear, they won't line up and join together nicely. So the new bearings that I have here, the input shaft bearing, which is normally a three-piece bearing, these are not popping out on the new style bearing. So what I'm going to do is use my propane torch and heat the insides and just push that over to line it up with everything, and then I can heat and put my last part of my pinion bearing on. Once we've got all that in, I'll assemble the forks, set all the adjustment, it'll be ready to install into the case. Alright, so I've got the bearing in. It's not in all the way, just had a little oops where the gear set separated, so I actually had to push it back a little bit. So to pull it in, I'm just going to go and put the gear on with the nut and the washer, and then I'll pull that bearing in the last probably about a mil or so, not too much, using the nut, which will be fairly simple. Okay, that's seated it. Cool. Then I can put my bearing on this side, assemble our first gear back into here in our hub, and tighten everything up correctly. Okay, so we've already I just slid on the other part of the bearing. I'm going to put the washer on, and then this is our inner part of our free-floating first gear. I have our new new roller bearing, but before we can put first gear back on, I need to press the dog teeth off, press on the new dog teeth, and then obviously put the synchro together. Okay, so to remove the dog teeth, you need one of these special tools, and it will slide over, and you just clamp it up along on the ridge for the circlip. First gear with the synchro ring popped off. You just got to check these little dogs, make sure there's no burrs. Sometimes they can get burred up. Clean off the last of the oil and put the new ring on. Okay, so this one right here is our synchro ring, our dog teeth that we pulled off. And it's not super horrible, but you can definitely see the difference. So I'm just going to compare these teeth right together. You can see how the original one that's come off, how the teeth are rounded over on the ends, whereas the new ones have a nice sharp edge. And this rounding is the sound that you hear whenever the gears grind. This is the slider running into our dog teeth. So I find the easiest way to press the new dog teeth on is to use the pulling tool, even though you could do it without it. Just in my opinion holds everything together nicely and allows me to be a lot more confident with that install. Okay, so I have lubricated the stretch bolt on the pinion shaft with some oil under the head and on the threads. This is the one part where you do use a lubrication. I also lubricated the input shaft nut and contact point on that washer. We've got the gear sets installed with our holding bracket on the front, which is going to lock the input shaft and stop it from turning. And then on my pinion shaft, I'm going to use a tool that I have fabricated to hold it. You can select a gear and use the input shaft to hold it. I generally just don't like the feeling of that, so I have a tool with using an old slider. I welded a couple of stands on it, and this is actually a BMW holding tool that it fits, and so I can use multiple things to hold it. The tightening torque on the pinion shaft stretch bolt is 110 to 120 Newton meters. So I usually go right in the middle, right around 115. Okay, so that's that pinion shaft tightened. Go ahead, slide our tool off. And now we've just got to tighten our input shaft. All right, so our input shaft nut is 60 to 65 Newton meters. And what I want to do with a castellated nut, because I have to line up where the roll pin goes, I start at the lowest torque, tighten it first, and then see where our roll pin slot falls. And that way I can tighten it as needed. So we can see right here, when I look at the hole, it's right in the middle of the hole. So I'm going to bring that torque up and bring it around to probably 65 to be able to get that roll pin back in. A tiny bit more. Okay, so this hole is halfway through, but the hole down the bottom right here is lined up, so I should be able to get my roll pin back in there. Okay, roll pin is in, pinion is tight. I can slide this out now and set up my selector forks. So to start, when I'm reassembling, I'm going to start with our 4/5 selector. Drop that into the gear. Then this part right here has to line up with the bolt hole right here. So I'm just going to slide this through, and I want to leave everything loose for right now because we need to adjust it. Going to grab our shift fork bolt, just put it in there, but I'm going to leave it loose. And whenever I put anything in, so I know that it's loose, I never screw it all the way down till I'm ready to tighten it. I need to get our detent system in, so I'm going to start with one of our detent balls. And what I use is a little tiny flat blade screwdriver to help me lock it in, and then just push it down into the hole. See how I've got my intermediate plate at a slight angle? That way the bowl will want to roll down. Then next is going to come our spring. So when I'm putting this spring in, I've got my center support in. I'm just going to push it in from here, and I'm going to use my screwdriver to just gently move it all the way down. So it is sitting in all the way in. Now I'm going to take my next detent ball, sit it in that little tiny hole, and what I want to do is just push it up. And if you hang on to this rod, what you're going to see, I'm going to pop it out a little bit, is, there we go. As I put pressure, watch right here, as I put pressure on that detent, you can actually lock it into place. It needs to be in its neutral position to be able to get the other shift rod in this part. When I'm going to install my second, third shift fork and rod assembly, I want to put my fork on the rod first. That way I don't have to balance while I'm holding my detent ball, and then we're going to take it up and put it, slide it in. So I'm holding my detent ball with my screwdriver so I can push it in. I want to bring up my selector fork and drop it over my slider, line up the hole, and then I'm going to depress that ball and slide it in like that. And once again, I can feel when my selector rod drops into that neutral position. You can feel it when you're pressing it in as well. And then I should be able to just take that bolt, once again start it, but leave it visibly loose. Okay, the next one is our interlock, and what this does is it stops you from selecting two gears at once, and hopefully it'll just slide on through and slide into there. And the way that this works is when I actually do select that gear, if you look in, you can see as I'm pushing that shift rod, it's starting to move that interlock out. This stops if you have an accidental double engagement selecting 2 gears at once, which would be catastrophic while driving. And then we have our first reverse shaft that we're just going to slide in like that, and we'll do the selector on the back end, but right now it's just going to slide in and get it in that neutral position, and then take our last detent ball and our spring, which is going to push down into there, and then followed up by our plug. When it comes to installing the plug here, Porsche did not use a gasket on these early ones, and if you did actually put a copper gasket on there, you're going to reduce the amount of spring pressure on this particular spring. What I use is a small amount of either 574 or 518. 518 is what Loctite has been producing since about 2018 now. It is similar properties. It's actually a little stronger than the 574 as far as gasket adhesion. So all I want to do is just a small amount to seal my threads. And where most people go wrong when they use sealant is they'll use like a half a tube right here, thinking that more sealant is better, and that is not the case. Lightning torque on this, it's an M10 bolt, so it's going to be 35 Newton meters. Before we can adjust our gear sets, we need to get our first reverse slider and shift fork installed on the back side of the intermediate case. If you remember, our original one was showing some signs of wear, so we've put a new dog teeth onto our first gear, as well as a new sliding assembly. We sit our selector fork onto the slider first. We want to line up the 3 guide pins with our hub. And slide our part on. And then we're going to start our bolt again. So here's our basic setup. We can see how much movement we have here. We need to support our gear sets. If we come over here, we can see we have that same movement on all of our selector forks. What we need to do next is we need to put on our special fixture that's going to hold our gear sets. We need to adjust our clearance on these forks, as well as center our selectors in between the 2 gears. On the reverse first side of things, we've got to be very careful because there is going to be our reverse idler gear, which is going to be sitting offset. There's a pin right here. We need to make sure that we are close enough to first gear that we're not dragging, but if we're too far back from our first gear, you run the risk of impacting that reverse idler. So we're going to set that part up next. So before we can adjust our selector forks, what I've done is I've rotated my intermediate plate in my vise, making sure, I want to stress too, I have aluminum vise protectors in on my vise. We do not want to use a steel jawed vise against our intermediate plate. That will effectively trash it. We're going to install our assembly jig. What this does is, right now all of my forks can wiggle and move around and are not very secure. So what we need to do is install our fixture that holds all of these in the position as if they were being held in the actual case. That way what it does is it limits now how much movement I'm going to have here, so I can accurately set up my shift fork adjustments. So there's a couple of adjustments that I'm doing. One is our adjustments here. So if you look at my shift rod, you can see how I can rotate this rod and rotate this rod. So what we are doing is, when we are setting up our shift forks, we're not only centering the shift fork in between the 2 gears, we're also setting up our clearance between these rods. Now, if these rods are set up too close together, what happens is they can run the risk of actually vibrating and making a rattle sound, but more importantly, there's a chance that when you are selecting, say, this gear back and forth, that you could try and pick up this rod at the same time. So the clearance clearance between these rods is supposed to be between 2 millimeters and 3 millimeters. So a quick way to check your setup if you're not sure what that should look like, I've just stacked some feeler gauges, and if I take my vernier, I'm right around 2.55 millimeters, so right in the middle of that clearance range. So when I'm setting up my rods, all I need to do is peel that rod back, put my gauge in there, bring it up till it contacts, should be nice and smooth, and that's what 2.5 millimeters should look like. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is make sure all of my rods are centered on their detents and are in their neutral position. So I'm just going to wiggle them back and forth when I do that. I want to make sure that my center selector rod, this is for second and third gear, is pretty much, this piece is centered straight up and down. We can see it's got some movement either way. So I'll take it all the way to one side, all the way to the other side, bring it back kind of in the middle. Then take my 2.5 millimeter gauge, and I'm going to lift up and hold that just so it's got a nice contact. Check it on both sides. Lastly, I want to make sure that I am centered on my selector. So when I do that, I'm looking at where my dog teeth are, and what I want to usually do is bring them up till they're just outside the selector fork and check that they are exactly the same on both sides. So I'm going to show you what it looks like when it's misadjusted. So if I push this all the way over, we can see that the dog teeth right here are contacting against our synchro. And on this side, we can see there's a big air gap. So we want to make this exactly in the middle. And to do that, normally if I line up my dog teeth so they're just at the beginning of the synchro band on each side, that looks pretty good. Then what I can do is tighten my lock bolt right here on my selector fork. Just going to make sure I didn't move. 2.5 millimeters. And the tightening torque on these is 25 Newton meters. Right there. When I tighten this bolt, it's going to lock our shaft and stop it from moving closer to our selector fork, and it's also going to lock our fork on the shaft in that position. So I'm going to repeat the same for our adjustment right here on our second third, and then the adjustment out the back here for our first reverse. Now I'm just going to adjust my fork. I don't need to check any clearances on this rod. I am going to adjust my second, third gear selectors. Same thing, I just want to make sure that the selector is right in the exact middle of the two gears. Once it is, I'm going to tighten the bolt. Okay, then for our first reverse, what I'm going to do here is same thing. I need to adjust my side clearance. Use my 2.5 millimeters. Then I want to bring my gear up, and what I normally do is I set the first gear dog teeth so they are just off the edge of that synchro. Right there, and then I know from experience that if I'm set right off of here that it's going to give me the 2 to 3 mil clearance that I need off of our reverse idler. If you are not sure, the other way to do that would be to pull your reverse idler shaft out of the end housing, put it into the bore here, set up everything, hold it, and then you could measure that. I have done that a number of times, so right now I've had good luck doing it the way I am. Okay, make sure we didn't move. That looks good. Looks good, feels good. I'm just going to move everything and make sure it comes back to that neutral position. Okay, and that's the last setups that we need to do on our gear carrier. So on our differential carrier, when we pulled it out, this bearing came off really easy. And on this one, as you can see all of the scoring, I can feel it with my fingernail, and when I measure it, it is definitely undersized. So we found another carrier at the junkyard, and it came with bearings on it. When I pulled the bearings off, this one came off really easily. I washed up the carrier, and when I actually measured it, even though it doesn't look as horrible, I've just cleaned this up with a little bit of Scotch-Brite, it still measures too small. So this is a common problem with these early differentials, is this back diff bearing or side bearing tends to want to spin on the housing. So I have a third one here that we got from the junkyard again. I called him up and said, hey, our carrier is no good that we got. He sent us another one. This one came with bearings off of it. I've had a quick look at it and it already looks a lot better, but I'm going to wash it up and then re-inspect it with a micrometer. Okay, so I'm just going to take some quick measurements. So this part of the housing, the bearing had not spun. And we've got a pretty nice 45.268. Now the other thing that I have also done is I've measured the inside of bearings before, and we are looking for a minimum of like 0.03 to 0.05 of interference. This is the side of the housing that has spun, and it's going to be hard to get a good measurement just because of the bolts are right here. In fact, I can't get a good measurement at all. So 45.265. 45.280, so this one is actually a little bit bigger, which will work just fine. That bearing will have a good interference. As a comparison, this one we failed is approximately 0.05 of a millimeter smaller. And because the bearing interferences are so small, that 0.05 is enough of a difference to where if I put a bearing on this carrier, it would just spin. So we have a good carrier. I'm going to transfer the ring gear. These are the locking tabs. I'm just going to peel these open so I can get them off and take all the bolts out. Okay. Doesn't matter where this ring gear is indexed. We do want to make sure we clean all the oil off of it, which I'm going to do next, and clean my bolts, and then we can transfer it onto our new carrier. So I've done a rough clean on this just to get most of the oil off. What I want to do, I want to make sure this is perfectly flat, so when it bolts up against the carrier, I don't want anything here. This is mainly just staining from oil. I'm just going to take my little piece of Scotch-Brite and just go over everything, make sure it's nice and clean. Okay, and then all I'm doing here is I'm just running my fingers over it lightly to see if there's any burring or anything around these bolt holes. That all feels good. We've already washed this side through our parts washer, so there was just oil trapped between the joint. This is ready for a final clean down and then install. So this is our carrier that we got from our junkyard, and I've already given it a clean, and we've Scotch-Brited this surface. But what I noticed when I was cleaning was, because this is a junkyard part, it sat on itself, and there's some little nicks and stuff like this one right here. So I'm going to take a small flat file And I'm just going to run over this part. I can feel another one right there. What we don't want is any imperfections on this surface that can cause that ring gear to be held up. That would create a tight spot in our differential. And we're more concerned with the flatness than we are with runout. Obviously runout is a concern, but the way these parts are machined, this taper here allows it to drop over here, and it's going to locate that ring gear right against here and against this surface on the carrier. So I just want to be careful. I just want to take the burrs off. I don't want to remove any other material. So I'm keeping my file essentially flat, and I can feel it and hear it when it's cutting. Like right here, I can feel it. There's a burr on the edge here. Then we don't want to use any power tools on this, like power gasket cleaners or anything like that, because we run the risk of creating an irregular surface. With a nice flat file, I can maintain that control a lot nicer. Okay, ready for a final clean. What to do now is take my ring gear and slide it onto my housing. Then I'm just going to pop it upside down while I hold things, line up my holes, and there is no indexing to this. They are all equally spaced. Just going to get a couple started to hold the ring gear in place. And then get everything screwed in. Just brought everything down finger tight right now. Next thing I'm going to do is carefully lock this in our vise using our soft jaws around this surface. We want to make sure that I'm not sitting my teeth up against our vise, and we do need those aluminum soft jaws installed. Okay, so once we're secured, now I'm just going to tighten our bolts, and I'm just going to tighten in a circular pattern. So I'll go one this side, then like this, next one, next one, next one, next one, all the way around till I'm torqued. Okay, so the tightening torque on our differential bolts here is between 100 and 120 Newton meters. I'm going to go at 110 and just tighten them down. Okay, it's everything tightened down, ready to put our lock plates on. Okay, so our lock plates, pretty straightforward, are just going to slide in. I'm just going to close it. And when I close it, I just hold a little bit of pressure on it. It will pull itself in. And then finally what we need to do is peen one of the flat portions to actually lock it. So just squeezing these does not physically lock it. We actually need to fold one of the flats. Okay, that's it. So we've locked all of our bolts. And now, because this is a new carrier, we need to install some side bearings and start setting up our preloads and our backlash. So there's two settings we need to set up with our differential. One is going to be our bearing preload, so that means how much crush we have between our two side bearings, S1 and S2. And our side bearings are going to sit like this on each end. And the other setting is going to be backlash. Optimal backlash is going to be engraved into our differential right here. So we have the optimal setting is going to be 0.15 is going to be optimal. So where to start? What I normally do is I start at what came out. Now if I was setting up a completely brand new transmission, I would follow the factory shop manual, which says to put a 3.5 millimeter shim and a 3 millimeter shim, 3.5 on S1, 3 millimeter on S2, put it in the case, measure our bearing drag, and then go ahead and set up our backlash. What I normally do is measure the size shims that came out with the old carrier and then start with that as a starting point. Now I may still have to pull bearings on and off, it just depends, but I find that's usually a much better starting point than using the factory method. So in this particular case we had 3.1 millimeter shims. I'm going to take my shim and put it on. There's two parts to the shim. You have a tapered part and you have a flat part. The tapered part needs to go down against the actual carrier, so I drop that on like that. Then I'm going to take my bearing, and these you can either heat them on or just tap them on with a hammer and a punch.
Okay.
Hotter than these gloves can handle. While I'm waiting for my side bearings to cool down on my differential carrier, I'm going to install the outer part of the race into the case. And we also want to make sure that this is a nice tight fit. It shouldn't just push in and drop in, which it doesn't. So this one feels good, and I'm just going to tap it in until it's seated home, and do the same with the diff side cover. So what I'm going to start with is my bearing preloads. So I'm just going to set my differential into the housing, and we are going to drop on our side bearing plate, and we're going to put a couple of nuts on here just to stop it from moving around, try and center it, and we're going to measure our clearance between our side case housing and our actual diff housing. So our bearing preload nominal value needs to be 0.15 of a millimeter. And since I don't want to put my gasket in, I'm going to measure my gasket. My gasket measures 0.215. I'm going to give that a nominal of 0.2 just because there will be a certain amount of crush on this gasket when I install it. So that means I am looking for a clearance of 0.35 is going to be my optimal clearance to give me the correct bearing preload that I need. So I'm going to use my feeler gauges at 0.35 and see how close we are. Alright, so what I'm looking for is my 0.35 should slide in, which it does, though I'm getting a little tight here, so I'm not sure if that's going to be just because of where I'm pulling my nuts down. When you put these nuts on, they just need to be tight enough to hold the cover against the bearing, not actually deflect the cover. Okay. It's getting kind of tight back by the nut. What I'm doing with my feeler gauge, because it looks like I'm just moving it around and playing with the nuts, is I'm trying to get my cover balanced. So right here, my feeler gauge small falls in, and then we are bigger than 0.35 of a millimeter. If I come over to this side, right here up against my nut, I am tight right there. But it's not that our clearance is bigger than 0.35. What I'm feeling is when I screwed down the nuts, there's no way to perfectly balance this. So we need to find that average point. So I just let off on this nut a little, just to allow me to get my feeler gauge in, so it's nice smooth there. And then I've got that slight tension. This one I've got a slight tension on, and then I'm coming back over to here to measure and see, is it tight or is it loose over here. Now my clearance right here feels pretty good. I can feel a slight drag, and I would say that our basic preload setting is probably right where it needs to be. Now we're going to verify that when we actually measure the running torque that it requires to move it, but I've got the cover fairly well, constant pressure at 0.35 of a millimeter all the way around. So now I've got my basic preload setting measured. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to put my pinion gears in and then stick it back in. I'll tighten the cover down with the gasket and measure the actual drag that we have on the bearings to confirm our preloads. So when I assemble this, I'm just going to take some gear oil. Now most of our assembly on the transmission has been dry, and that's because we are putting gaskets and bearings and other parts onto shafts, and the way that it needs to be measured, oil will get in the way. But on here, a little bit of pre-lube on the bearing surfaces is not going to hurt anything. So it's going to get everything ready. So this one is a little bit of a juggling act. I've got my first sun gear sitting there, or side gear. Then my next one, then what I need to do is get my pinion gears installed to hold everything together, and they need to be kind of exactly opposite each other. And then I'm going to rotate it sideways. Like so. Grab my shaft. Then I need to drop our center shaft. This is what we bolt our flanges on for our drive gears. This is going to go through the center. Slide that through. Line it all up. Now we've got there's a hole in the center of this shaft, so we need to shine our flashlight down through the top because we have our roll pin that needs to be installed. That's what ties everything together, stops this from moving around a bunch. Plus, once the side flanges go on for the drive shafts, they'll also help center that piece. Okay, when it comes to getting this pin started, there's no real good way in my opinion. So normally what I'll do is just slide it in there and use a long punch to push it down, and I want to get it started in this housing first. So I usually feel it coming around. Okay, I got it started, but now I have to line it up. If you want to take a look down there, you can see the pin started.
Oh yeah, with the light on.
Line it up. Make sure it's lined up before I start driving it in. Okay, so what I've got, so I'm using a long awl just to come down and locate, make sure I'm somewhat centered on that pin. And then I'm just gently tapping my roll pin in. And right now I can feel it actually pushing my awl back, so I know that we're coming in. We don't want to force this or hit really, really hard. We just want to gently tap it in and kind of feel it in. I twist, I'm turning everything. You can see my entire gear set is moving. Says that I am locked in with my pin. So I had to pop my pin out again because when I got my pin in, we had our pinion gears off by 1 tooth. And what that means is I couldn't get my side flanges in. And if we look here, I've got my pin installed holding this gear into place. But if we look at this one, we can see it's off by 1 tooth. So our pin can't just slide through and line up. And this is part of the juggling act when you're doing these pinion gears. And to fix it, I'm just going to slide this out the whole way. And we need to rotate, and see I'm holding the bottom one so it doesn't fall out. So come all the way around, so I got room to work. And I'm just going to pick this up, drop it over 1 tooth, and then roll it back around and see if we're aligned again. There we go. Yep, now we're aligned and I can slide all the way through. So with both of these gears installed, everything's there, I can put my roll pin back in. Okay, home on my roll pin. Both of my hubs go in and my gear sets rotate nice and freely. So that's what we're looking for with our pinion setups. Okay, we're going to go drop this back into our transmission case. So with this time, we do need to use our gasket, so we're just going to be very careful that we don't damage it, because we are going to be in and out, because the next thing we need to do is pull it out if our preload is correct. If we have to adjust our preload, then we'll have to change shims, in which case bearings will get pulled off. But we also need to put our gear set in to measure our backlash. So we're going to be going in and out a number of times. So we just want to be as carefully as we possibly can with this gasket, because it is not final assembly time. Okay, this time we need to use all of the studs, and we are going to use all of the nuts so that we pull the side cover down evenly. So first I'm just going to run all of the nuts down just by hand, and then I'll come around and tighten them to 25 Newton meters, which is the running torque that they're going to operate at. Next, I'm just going to drop in my flange, and for this I'm going to need the thrust washer, goes in, and the actual stretch bolt, because this is what we're going to turn to be able to measure our drag. Now if we try and measure our drag here, obviously that's not going to work because our pinion gears are turning. So we're going to measure our drag on this stretch bolt. Right, with the bolt in, what I want to do first is settle my bearings. So I'm just going to take a regular ratchet, just spin it a dozen times, half a dozen times, kind of whatever you feel like, and then back the other direction, like that. Then, next thing I'm going to do is use a drag meter. And this is going to measure the amount of running torque that I have on our actual side bearings. Zero my pointer. And I want to take that running torque, not the starting torque, but the actual running torque. So I want to look at it as I'm rotating. And I'm going to reset my pointer so I've got a fairly accurate reading. So right now we are running at a bearing preload of looks like around 22 inch-pounds, or in Newton meters about 2.5 Newton meters of running drag. So I'm just going to compare that to our specifications and see where we should be. So looking at the specification, the drag should be between 18 and 24 centimeters instead of Newton meters kilopascal. That's going to translate to 1.8 to 2.4 Newton meters, or in inch pounds, 15.6 to 20.8. We are running approximately 22, but it could be 21 as well. So it's right at the high end of the preload, which is where we want it to be, because as these bearings run, they are going to settle in. So our bearing preload is correct. We're just going to move on and measure our backlash next. The next thing we need to do is put our pinion shaft or our complete gear set back into the transmission case with the correct gasket that we calculated for our pinion depths and measure our gear backlashes. Before I put my complete gear cluster into the transmission case, I want to engage fifth gear, and I'm going to do that so it moves the selector further forward, because we've got to kind of slide in and lift up a little bit to engage when we have all of our selector forks on. Come on. So we just got our temporaries to hold our intermediate plate torqued against the gasket. Okay, so we have our intermediate gear plate or intermediate plate with all of our gear sets installed. I have fifth gear engaged, and I also engaged first gear up here. The reason that I can do that is the shaft separation, the detent system, will allow me to engage first and fifth. That has locked our gear sets. But we still have some free play right here on our gears. This is not the actual free play that we're measuring here. It's a little bit of back and forth between these gear sets, which is normal. So I take my tensioning tool that I use when I hold this pinion shaft, and I just put a little bit of pressure on that so that it takes all of the preloads out of the gears. Next, if I take my other shaft, slide it into the differential, and what I'm feeling is I'm rocking these back and forth, and we can hear and I can feel that preload. Now what I need to do is measure that actual preload, and I'm going to use a dial gauge to do that and actually rock it back and forth against the pinion shaft to make sure that we have the specified backlash. I have my fixture attached to our differential. We've got our pinion shaft locked up. We're in 2 gears. I've got some counterweight on here using my tightening tool to take out any of the backlash in the gear sets. And what I'm doing is I'm measuring my gear set backlash. So what I do is I've got top and bottom. I have the axle flanges on each side, and I'm just rocking very gently back and forth on the backlash of the ring and pinion against the pinion shaft. Now on this one, the specification was 0.15 is optimal. Porsche says it can be anywhere from 0.12 to 0.18 is the range that is acceptable. Right now I'm measuring 0.19, so it's a little on the big side. So to correct this, what I have to do is pull the differential out, and I have to rearrange my S1 and S2 shims without changing the overall total thickness. So our total thickness right now to have the correct preload on our bearings is 6.2 millimeters. So what we're going to do is I need to move the differential closer to the pinion gear. So we have 3.1 and 3.1 as our shim sizes right now. I'm going to replace S2, which is down here, with a 3 millimeter shim, and S1 with a 3.2 millimeter shim. That will move the differential closer to our pinion shaft, and then we can recheck and see what our backlash is while maintaining our preload of 6.2 millimeters. So as I'm tightening this cover down, I'm just going to be turning my input shaft. I've unlocked my reverse gear, first reverse, so I'm only in 5th gear right now. So I can be rotating the differential at the same time. And what we don't want to do is I want to make sure that the differential doesn't bind up as I nip down the nuts, because that would mean that the crown wheel is too close to the pinion. So I'm just making sure that it still turns nicely with no tight spots as I tighten the cover down. So what I'm doing is I'm just locking everything up right now. I'm still in 5th gear inside the transmission. So I'm just going to lock my input shaft. I'm going to go put it back into 1st gear. This is just a repurposed head stud, which I'm using to go down and lock in because the bolt won't be long enough. Bringing my bracket with my dial gauge on. And because my head stud is a little bit long, I just got a couple of spacer nuts. And before I tighten that, I want to make sure that my bottom flange is in, because that can move things around. I'm going to adjust my gauge. I'll zero it in just a minute. Okay, so here is our problem. We have made the smallest change that we could possibly make, and now our clearance is actually on the small side, it's 0.12. So this needs to be checked in 4 different places as well. So I'm going to do that before I make a decision whether or not I want to leave it slightly on the large side or slightly on the small side. Right now we're either side of that tolerance. So same. 0.12. I think I'm going to leave it on the tight side. So we've checked our differential in 4 different places. We're getting a consistent 0.12 in our backlash. We've decided to leave it on the minimum side of that spec. Reason being is bearings are going to settle, things are going to open up, and that clearance is going to open up slightly in use. It's a better option than leaving it where it was outside of the maximum spec at 0.19 millimeters. So all we've got left now, all of our settings are done, is to completely reassemble the transmission. So that's going to require disassembling it first, because we need to do final cleanovers on everything, put some oil on our bearings to lubricate those, install all of our oil seals. You notice down in here we've been doing all of our setup with no oil seals. That is because oil seals will add to the drag numbers on bearing preload, so we want to make sure we do everything without those installed. We're going to do our final assembly on all of our gaskets, making sure all of our surfaces are perfectly clean and dry, ready for that final assembly.